15-year-old Jalen Carter knew what it meant to carry the weight of the world. In Brookside Heights, a neighborhood where cracked sidewalks told stories of neglect and the glow of the setting sun barely masked the hardships of its people, Jalen moved through life with quiet resilience. His curly hair, his faded hoodie, his worn-out sneakers, each detail painted a picture of a boy who had learned too early that survival was a daily battle. After school, Jalen rode his bike to Corner Grocery, weaving through the streets like he had done 100 times before. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Every extra dollar he earned stacking shelves helped his mother, Angela, keep their tiny apartment. Every shift he worked meant his little brother, Caden, who struggled with asthma, might have a better night. But no matter how hard he worked, some things never changed. His father had learned that the hard way. "Your daddy was put in cuffs for the color of his skin," Angela had told him once, her voice low, as if afraid the walls could hear. That memory clung to Jalen, a reminder that the system wasn't built for people like them. Hearing his bike tires roll against the pavement, steady, weary, felt like the rhythm of his own heart, beating against the weight of a world that had already decided his fate. Inside Corner Grocery, Jalen was stacking cans when chaos unfolded. Two white teenagers, laughing, reckless, rushed past him, knocking over a display before bolting out the door. The manager, Carl, a middle-aged white man with suspicion in his eyes, didn't even glance at the security cameras. "You knocked that over," Carl snapped. Jalen barely had time to protest before Carl grabbed the phone. Moments later, Officer Reed walked in. Reed, broad shoulders, shaved head, a man who carried authority like a weapon, looked at Jalen the way a cat looks at a trapped mouse. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. "You again," Reed muttered, shaking his head as if Jalen had already been convicted. Without hesitation, he pulled out his cuffs, grabbing Jalen's wrist with a grip that burned. Jalen froze. His breath hitched. "I didn't do anything," he said, his voice even, but his heart pounded. Reed smirked. "Kids like you belong here." Then, leaning in, his voice dropped to a chilling whisper. "Your daddy didn't help me years ago. Now, you get to pay the price." The cold metal of the handcuffs locked around Jalen's wrists, cold as hate, tight as the grip of a system that had never let go. The world outside went on as usual. People walked by, barely sparing a glance at the black teenager being shoved into a police car. No one questioned it. No one stopped it. Because in places like Brookside Heights, this was just how things worked. Inside the squad car, the stench of leather and sweat filled Jalen's lungs. His hands, stiff from the cuffs, clenched into fists. He turned to the window, staring at the city flashing past. Streets he had known his whole life, now blurring into a place he might never return to. Reed let out a low chuckle. "Stay quiet, or I'll add more charges." Jalen didn't respond. His fingers curled around the inside of his hoodie pocket, gripping onto the worn edges of an old photograph. His father, his mother, a time before everything was stolen. The anger inside him burned, but he wouldn't let it break him. Not yet. Do you believe justice can still exist for kids like Jalen? If you want to see him fight back, keep watching, because somewhere, somehow, justice is waiting to be claimed. If this story moves you, hit the like button, share it, and subscribe for more stories of resilience. Your support helps us keep the fight for truth alive. Let's dive in. The cell was small. Too small. Jalen sat on a hard metal bench, his wrists raw and bruised from the cuffs. The flickering fluorescent light above him buzzed like an insect trapped behind glass, a low, grating hum that filled the silence. Steel bars lined his world now, cold, rigid, unyielding. The air was thick with the stale stench of sweat and something sour, something rotting. It clung to his skin, burrowing deep into his lungs. The walls felt closer than they should. He shifted slightly, wincing as his wrist grazed the rough metal of the bench. The dried blood where the cuffs had bitten into his skin cracked with the movement. His hands curled into fists, trying to hold on to something, anything, that felt solid. His breath was steady, but his chest was tight, as if the air itself carried weight. Then, a thought cut through the fog of fear. Caden. Jalen could picture his little brother lying in bed, struggling to breathe, his small chest rising and falling in uneven rhythms. The memory of his wheezing echoed in Jalen's ears. Was he okay? Was Mom holding it together without him? Panic flickered at the edge of his mind, but he forced it down. He couldn't afford to break. Not here. Then, voices. He stiffened. Just beyond the bars, down the dimly lit hallway, two officers spoke in hushed tones. Blake's handling this one. A pause. The judge? Yeah. Hates kids like him. But Harris is putting pressure on him. Wants him to make an example. Laughter. Casual, indifferent. Jalen swallowed hard. Blake. The name sent a cold shiver through him. Judge Blake. He'd heard whispers about him before, how he never ruled in favor of kids like Jalen, how his sentences were always the harshest when a black boy stood before him. An example. Jalen's stomach twisted. They weren't just talking about punishing him for a crime he didn't commit. They wanted to bury him. They had already decided. Before he even walked into that courtroom, before he even opened his mouth. His fate had been sealed the moment Reed locked those cuffs around his wrists. Jalen gritted his teeth, pressing his palms against the cold metal bench, grounding himself against the suffocating weight settling over him. This wasn't about a broken shelf, it never was. This was about power, about control. About a system that had already decided what he was before he even had the chance to prove them wrong. Outside the cell, the voices faded, their laughter swallowed by the hum of the prison. Inside, Jalen sat in silence, staring at the bars, feeling them tighten around his future. The sound of steel, cold, heavy, pressed against his ears like a prophecy, whispering that hope was a foolish thing to hold on to. But he wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. The cell door screeched open. Jalen didn't move, he didn't flinch, but his body knew, his muscles tensed before his mind even registered the danger. Officer Reed stepped inside, his heavy boots thudding against the concrete, deliberate, controlled. A predator entering a cage where he already owned the prey. Jalen didn't look up. He wouldn't give him that satisfaction. A sharp laugh. Still got some fight in you, huh? Reed's voice was low, amused, like he was enjoying this. Then a hand yanked him up. Jalen gasped as his back slammed against the cold concrete wall. His breath stuttered from the impact, but he held firm. He wouldn't break, not in front of him. Reed leaned in close, his breath thick with coffee and something bitter. Jalen refused to turn away. You listen to me, boy, Reed murmured, his fingers tightening around Jalen's collar. Keep your mouth shut, or I'll stack the charges so high you'll forget what daylight looks like. Silence. Jalen clenched his jaw. You think anyone's gonna believe you? Reed scoffed. A black kid from Brookside Heights? Jalen's fists curled at his sides. Face it, Reed sneered, his grip tightening before shoving Jalen harder into the wall. No one gives a damn what happens to you. And me? I haven't forgotten your old man. Jalen's breath caught. He should have played nice when I asked for his help, Reed continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. Now his son gets to pay the price. Something inside Jalen snapped. His father's face flashed in his mind, the strength in his eyes, the quiet dignity in his stance. His mother's voice echoed, don't let them win. Reed saw the flicker of defiance, his eyes darkened. You got something to say, kid? He challenged. Jalen's heart pounded, rage simmering beneath his skin, but he stayed silent. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood something now. Reed wanted him to crack. He wanted a reaction. And Jalen wasn't going to give him one. So instead, he did something that made Reed's jaw clench. He smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible. But it was there, and it made Reed's nostrils flare. Feel that helplessness, Jalen's rage, frozen under Reed's sneer. But a spark had been lit, and he wouldn't let Caden lose him too. Reed's grip tightened for just a second before he let go, shoving Jalen aside. You'll learn, he muttered before stepping back toward the door. Jalen didn't answer. Didn't give him the reaction he wanted. But as Reed left, Jalen's fingers curled around the loose lace of his sneaker. His mother's words whispered through his mind. Don't let them win. He wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. The phone rang 3 times before a voice finally answered. Angela gripped the receiver so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her voice trembled, barely holding together the panic threatening to consume her. Please, Mr. Rivera. You have to help my son. There was a pause on the other end, then a steady, measured voice responded. Angela, I've heard. I know what's happening. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes, but she blinked them away. There was no time to break down. I have something, she whispered. A photo of our family. It connects to Blake. Silence. Then Rivera's voice dropped lower, more urgent. Angela, listen to me. I have a file on Blake. But a file alone won't be enough. We need proof, something irrefutable. Angela's fingers trembled as she pressed the photo against her chest. This was it. The one thing that might save her son. I'll get it to you, she said. Just, please, get my baby out of there. Jalen's hands curled around the fabric of his hoodie. The rough seat of the transport van vibrated beneath him as the vehicle rumbled down the road. The thick air inside smelled of sweat and rust, and the cuffs on his wrists rattled against the metal restraints. But Jalen wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about the weight inside his pocket. The photo, his fingers pressed against the worn edges through the fabric. A piece of paper, small and fragile, but holding something far bigger than ink and faded colors. A memory, a connection, a truth that they never wanted to come to light. His heart pounded, not from fear, from something else. A fire. Small but fierce. For the first time since those cold cuffs had locked around his wrists, Jalen allowed himself to believe, maybe, just maybe, there was still a way out. As the van turned sharply, his grip on the photo tightened. He wasn't walking into that courtroom alone. The courtroom felt heavier than it should. Not just quiet, but suffocating. The kind of silence that didn't come from respect, but from inevitability. A silence that told Jalen this wasn't justice. It was theater. Then the door creaked open. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoed against the polished marble floor, each step carrying the weight of a verdict already decided. The air in the room seemed to tighten, thick with unspoken truths. Judge Blake had arrived. His black robe swayed like a storm cloud as he stepped onto the bench. The heavy gavel in his grip wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon. His presence alone seemed to pull the warmth from the room, leaving behind only a cold certainty. Jalen didn't move. He had never met Judge Blake before, but he knew him. He had heard his name whispered in hushed tones at barbershops, in kitchen conversations his mother thought he couldn't hear. He had seen the aftermath of his rulings, the lost faces, the heavy shackles, the futures erased with a single slam of the gavel. And now it was his turn. Blake's icy blue eyes landed on him. Not in curiosity, not even in scrutiny, but in dismissal. Then a slow smirk. Another one. His voice was almost amused, as if he had seen this story before and already knew the ending. He adjusted his robe, settling into his chair with the ease of a man who didn't question his power, because he had never needed to. The room held its breath. Blake turned his head slightly, barely looking at Officer Reed. His voice dropped, just above a whisper. If this kid walks, Harris buries me. Make it clean. Jalen felt his stomach drop. It wasn't a trial, it was a transaction. A favor exchanged, a political game played in whispers. His fate had been decided before he ever stepped into this room. His fingers curled into fists. He wasn't expecting fairness. He wasn't expecting justice. But as Judge Blake's cold gaze settled back on him, waiting for him to shrink, to accept what was coming, Jalen did something else. He met his stare. He wasn't sure where the fire inside him came from. Maybe from his father's memory, maybe from his mother's whispered warnings, maybe from Caden, waiting for him to come home. But he held his ground. Blake's smirk twitched slightly, his amusement dimming just for a fraction of a second. And that was enough. Look into Blake's eyes, ice cold, dripping with scorn. He wasn't just a judge, he was an executioner, and he was ready to crush any hope Jalen had left. But Jalen wasn't done fighting yet. The courtroom felt colder now. Jalen sat still, his hands curled into fists beneath the table. The cuffs were gone, but the weight on his wrists remained, like invisible shackles, reminding him that freedom was never truly his to hold. The prosecution stood. Officer Reed stepped forward, his uniform crisp, his stance solid, his face unreadable. But Jalen knew better. That was the face of a man who had already won. Reed cleared his throat, then spoke. I caught the suspect in the act. He knocked over the shelves, attempted to flee, and when confronted, he resisted arrest. Lie. Jalen's nails dug into his palms. I detained him immediately, following standard procedure. Lie. We have every reason to believe he intended to steal from the store. Lie. The words came smooth, polished, practiced. Across the room, Jalen saw the store manager, Carl Coleman, nodding along. His arms were crossed, his expression neutral, but his eyes flickered toward Blake, like he was waiting for approval. When he spoke, his voice was calm, too calm. That's correct. I saw the boy knocking things over. Looked nervous, shifty, like he was up to something. Another lie. Jalen's pulse pounded in his ears. He glanced toward the gallery, a sea of faces, watching but unmoving. Some looked away, shifting in their seats. A few furrowed their brows, uncomfortable. But none of them spoke. Because who would speak for a black boy in this courtroom? Blake exhaled, slow and deliberate. He tapped his gavel lightly against the bench, not to call for order, but as if he were already sealing Jalen's fate. Then he turned to Jalen with a look of feigned disappointment, shaking his head slightly. "You boys never learn, do you?" His voice was quiet, almost fatherly, but the ice beneath it cut deep. Then to the courtroom, louder now. "Enough. This young man is precisely the kind that needs proper correction before it's too late." Jalen's jaw clenched. The lies slid through the air like poison, smooth, deliberate, meant to seep into the cracks and take hold. He wanted to yell, to fight, to demand they look at the truth. But truth didn't matter here. Not in Judge Blake's courtroom. Not when the story had already been written before Jalen even opened his mouth. But beneath the crushing weight of it all, beneath the chains they were tightening around him with every word, his fire still burned. They weren't done yet, and neither was he. The room felt like it was closing in. The air was thick, heavy with something unspoken, something festering beneath the surface. Lies had been laid like bricks, stacking higher and higher, building the walls around Jalen until there was nothing left but the space they allowed him to exist in. He couldn't breathe. His pulse pounded in his ears as Blake's words hung in the air like smoke. "Enough. This young man is precisely the kind that needs proper correction before it's too late." Jalen's fingers curled into the fabric of his pants. His body tensed, coiled like a spring loom too tight. No, not this time. His chair scraped against the polished floor as he stood. Every movement felt electric, like a storm crackling through his veins, like thunder waiting to break. His voice, held back for too long, burned at the edges of his throat. But before he could speak, a hand clamped down on his wrist. "Wait." Rivera's voice was low, firm, a command, not a request. Jalen's head snapped to him, confusion and anger flickering across his face. "Not yet," Rivera whispered. His grip tightened just enough to hold Jalen still. Jalen's jaw clenched. "Not yet?" His mind screamed against the restraint. Every muscle in his body demanded action. But then, Blake laughed. Not just a chuckle, but a full-bodied, condescending laugh that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. "Oh, you really think you can win, don't you?" Blake leaned forward slightly, eyes glinting with amusement. Jalen's breath was slow, controlled. His hand slid into his hoodie pocket, fingers brushing against the edges of the worn photograph. His father's face stared back at him from the paper, frozen in time. Memories of whispered warnings. Of a case just like this. Of a man who had sat in this very courtroom decades ago, under this very judge, and walked away in chains. Jalen's grip tightened. He wasn't a victim, not this time. He was a fighter. Blake's laughter faded, but the weight of it still lingered, pressing against Jalen's skin like the heat before a storm. But storms didn't last forever, and this one was about to break. The gavel hovered in the air. Judge Blake's fingers tightened around the wooden handle, poised to bring it down, the final blow sealing Jalen's fate. His voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. 6 months in juvenile detention. A hush fell over the room. Not the quiet of order, but the quiet before impact. Jalen's heart pounded. His breath hitched. No. Before the gavel could strike, he stood. The sudden movement sent a ripple through the room. A sharp intake of breath. A murmur. Rivera turned, his eyes flashing a silent warning. Reed stiffened, his hand twitching toward his belt. But Jalen didn't care. Not anymore. His hands trembled, not with fear but with something stronger. His fingers dug into his hoodie pocket, brushing against the worn edges of the photograph. His proof. His truth. With one swift motion, he pulled it out and held it high. "Judge Blake," he said, his voice steady, unshaken. "Do you recognize this?" Silence. For a single breath, time seemed to freeze. Then Blake's expression changed. It was subtle at first. A flicker. A tightening of the jaw. Then his entire body went rigid. His eyes locked on the photograph, the color draining from his face. "No." His voice was barely more than a whisper. The picture trembled between Jalen's fingers, but the image was clear. Undeniable. A woman, young, barely 20, standing close to a man in uniform, a soldier, strong, proud. Angela Carter, his mother. And beside her, a man with familiar eyes, a quiet determination in his stance, his father. The man Judge Blake had sentenced 20 years ago. Gasps erupted from the courtroom. A murmur swept through the crowd, growing like a rising tide. People leaned forward, whispering, eyes darting between the photo and the judge. The tension cracked open, and then, chaos. That's him? He sentenced the father, now the son? Blake's hands clenched into fists. He gripped the gavel as if it could silence the truth unraveling before him. This is irrelevant, he snapped, his voice sharp, brittle. Sit down, boy. But Jalen didn't sit. He took a step forward. His pulse roared in his ears, but his words were clear. You sent my father to prison, didn't you? He let the weight of the question settle. And now you're trying to do the same to me. Blake's lips parted, but no words came. His fingers twitched around the gavel, his knuckles turning white. The murmur in the courtroom rose into something louder, something unstoppable. A woman gasped, then another. And then, like a fire catching wind, the room exploded. The room wasn't silent anymore. The courtroom was no longer in control. The storm had broken. The whispers had turned to shouts. The walls of power that Blake had built for himself, layered with lies, cemented with corruption, were starting to crack. But Jalen wasn't done. He tightened his grip on the photograph, his heart beat steady now. This wasn't just about him anymore. He turned to face Blake directly. You sent my father to prison, Jalen said, his voice strong, unwavering. Not because he was guilty, but because of the color of his skin. A ripple of gasps swept through the crowd. Blake's eyes darted around the room. He shifted in his chair, but his fingers were locked tight around the gavel, his last desperate attempt to hold on to control. Jalen took another step forward. And you didn't stop there. His voice cut through the air. You threatened my family. You made sure we stayed silent, because if the truth ever came out, it would ruin you. Blake's face darkened. That's enough, he barked, slamming the gavel down. This is nonsense. But Rivera was already rising. The defense attorney held a folder in his hands, thick, packed with documents. His expression was calm, measured, but his eyes burned with something else. Justice. Actually, Your Honor, Rivera said, placing the folder on the table. We have evidence proving otherwise. The crowd stilled. Rivera flipped open the folder. Judge Blake, he continued, his voice sharp as a blade, we have records linking you to multiple payouts from Senator Harris, specifically bribes made to ensure the wrongful conviction of Michael Carter, a conviction that stripped him of his home, his honor, and 20 years of his life. The weight of the words crashed down like thunder. Blake's lips parted, but no words came out. The room wasn't just watching anymore, they were judging. Some leaned forward, others whispered furiously to each other. The tide had turned, and Blake could feel it. Lies, he spat, but his voice lacked its usual force. His hands moved quickly, reaching for a stack of papers on his desk. Michael Carter wasn't innocent, he growled, lifting a document. I have proof, right here. Rivera didn't even blink. That document? He asked. The one you just pulled from your files? Blake hesitated. Rivera leaned forward, his voice calm but unrelenting. FBI analysts have already reviewed it. It's fake. A collective gasp. Blake's fingers twitched around the paper, his face drained of all color. No, his voice cracked. That's not possible. Rivera didn't let up. You fabricated evidence to put an innocent man behind bars. His words were slow, deliberate, and now you're trying to do it again. The courtroom erupted. Shouts, angry voices, people demanding answers. Blake's breathing grew shallow. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one holding the gavel. His fingers trembled, his back pressed against the chair. Then, a final, desperate plea. Harris will protect me, he blurted out, his voice cracking under the weight of his own unraveling. More gasps. Even Reed looked uneasy now, but it was too late. Blake had just admitted the one thing he never should have said. Jalen watched as the man before him, the man who had stolen his father's freedom, who had tried to steal his own, finally crumbled. 20 years of lies had just come undone. The courtroom was alive. The weight of 20 years of corruption buried beneath layers of fear and silence had finally cracked open. Blake's panicked words still lingered in the air. Harris will protect me. A confession that couldn't be unsaid, but the moment wasn't over. Not yet. A chair scraped against the floor. Slow, deliberate. All eyes turned. An elderly black woman standing near the back of the courtroom straightened her spine. Her silver hair was neatly braided, her hands worn with age, but her eyes held fire. "I saw it," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. The murmurs died down. Even Blake stopped moving. The woman took a step forward, gripping the wooden pew for support. "I was there," she continued, "the night Michael Carter was arrested." Jalen's breath caught. Blake's eyes darkened. "I saw Judge Blake," she said, voice carrying through the courtroom like a bell ringing after a long silence. "I saw him meet with the police. I saw the money change hands." Gasps rippled through the crowd, but she wasn't done. She lifted her chin. "And I saw Senator Harris. I saw him threaten the Carter family. I saw him tell Blake to make sure that man never walked free again." The energy in the room shifted. A town that had watched in silence for years was now watching with new eyes. Blake opened his mouth, but no words came. His hands gripped the bench, knuckles white. Then, another voice. A man near the front stood up, tall, broad shoulders, his voice deep, firm. "I have proof." The room froze. "I have documents," the man continued. "Bank transfers, meetings between Blake and Harris. I've been holding on to them for years, but if today is the day truth finally matters, then I'll bring them forward." The room erupted. Applause, shouts, a wave of voices breaking free from years of fear. Reed moved toward the crowd, hands raised in protest, but he was drowned out by the roar of the people. Blake looked around, his world collapsing. He had ruled this courtroom for decades, had silenced voices with power, with fear. But now they weren't afraid anymore. Jalen stood in the middle of it all, his heartbeat steady, watching as the walls of a broken system finally began to crumble. The gavel never fell. Blake never got to speak another word. The weight of his own crimes had already silenced him. The doors burst open. Uniformed officers flooded the room. The tide had finally turned. Not for him, not for Reed, not for the system they had built on fear and power. Blake jerked backward in his seat as two officers moved toward him. His hands shook as they reached for him. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. "Judge Victor Blake," one officer announced. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and falsification of evidence." Gasps echoed across the chamber. But then, a sound. Applause. Slow at first, then stronger. Like a wave rolling through the room, rising, crashing, consuming. Blake's face twisted. He turned, searching for Reed. But Reed was already being pulled away. His wrists locked in cuffs, his face pale. The man who had once dragged Jalen from a store in chains now stumbled in his own. "You can't do this!" Blake finally roared, struggling as the officers hauled him to his feet. "This courtroom is mine." Jalen watched, his mother beside him, his people around him. He didn't smile. Not yet. Blake turned, one last desperate plea. His eyes darted wildly across the room. "Harris will protect me," he shouted. "Harris will." A sharp voice cut through the noise. "Not anymore." A reporter stood near the back, phone in hand, broadcasting the moment to the world. "Senator Harris is under federal investigation. The network of corruption you built is crumbling." Blake froze. The gavel slipped from his fingers, landing on the bench with a hollow thud. It was over. The officers pulled him away. The man who had condemned so many was finally condemned himself. Jalen stood in the center of it all, and then his mother reached for him. Angela wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight, holding him like she had never been able to before. Not without fear. Not without the weight of the past pressing between them. For the first time, Jalen felt it. Freedom. The applause grew louder, roaring like a thunderstorm breaking a drought. The people of Millville rose, not for a corrupt judge, not for a broken system, but for justice. And this time, justice had won. The courtroom was emptying, but Jalen stood still. The roar of the crowd had faded. The weight of battle was lifting. But the moment, this moment, was something he wasn't ready to step away from just yet. He turned to his mother, Angela Carter, a woman who had carried the burden of a broken system on her back, who had fought in silence, who had endured. And now, finally, she was free. Jalen swallowed hard. His hands trembled as he reached for hers, gripping them tightly. "I almost couldn't do it, Mama." His voice was raw, barely above a whisper. "I was scared I'd lose you the way we lost Dad." Angela's fingers tightened around his. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She was too strong for that. Instead, she lifted her chin, her voice steady. "But you did do it," she said. And because of you, we're still standing. Your father didn't break, and neither did you. Jalen let out a breath, one he felt like he'd been holding for years. A voice called from behind them. Rivera. The lawyer stepped forward, still holding the file of evidence. The same file that had brought a corrupt empire crashing down. This fight isn't over. His voice was firm, but there was something else in his tone now. Something different. Hope. Harris's network runs deep. The corruption didn't end with Blake. There are more families out there, more cases like your father's, people who are still waiting for their justice. Jalen stared at the folder in Rivera's hands. For years, all he had wanted was to be free. Now standing in that courtroom, with the past behind him and the future waiting, he realized freedom wasn't enough. It wasn't just about his story. It was about all the others like him who'd been silenced. He looked back at his mother, saw the quiet pride in her eyes, saw his father's fight still burning in them. Then he turned to Rivera, his shoulders squared, his stance steady. Then I'll fight for them too. He exhaled, a decision settling in his chest like something unshakable. I'm going to study law. Angela smiled, tears finally slipping down her cheek. And I'll make sure no other family has to go through what we did. Rivera nodded, a rare smile crossing his face. Angela squeezed his hand one last time. Your father would be proud, she whispered. And Jalen knew this was only the beginning. The air outside Corner Grocery was thick with something new. Hope. The same streets where Jalen had once been dragged away in cuffs now held a different scene, a community standing together. People gathered, their faces illuminated by the glow of streetlights, their eyes locked onto him. Jalen stood at the center. His hands weren't shaking. His voice wasn't hesitant. Justice isn't a gift, he said, his words carrying through the night. It's something we have to fight for, every single day. The crowd murmured, nodding. Some whispered among themselves, others stood silent, taking in the weight of what had happened. But then his phone buzzed. Jalen glanced down. A message, unknown number. Stop now, or you'll regret it. His jaw tightened. He knew who it was. Senator Harris, or someone working for him. A warning, a threat. He lifted his gaze back to the crowd, took a slow breath. Then he turned the phone around, showing the message to everyone. Gasps rippled through the people. A few shook their heads. Others, their faces once filled with hesitation, now burned with determination. Jalen looked out at them all. He had been afraid once. He had doubted himself once. Not anymore. He lifted his chin. I'm not afraid. The words were calm, unshaken, and I'm not stopping. A pause, a heartbeat of silence. Then, cheers. Loud, roaring, unbreakable. A fire had been lit in Millville, and it would not burn out. Jalen let the sound wash over him, like rain after a drought, like a promise that his fight, their fight, was just beginning. Then his voice softened, but held steady. Will you keep this fire burning? The crowd leaned in. For me? For every voice silenced, a murmur of yeses echoed through the air. Then let's make sure the world hears us. His whisper was soft, but fierce.